A single decoded message from Hiroshima was about to shatter everything Iva Taguri believed about the war, about America, and about her own survival. It was August 6, 1945, just after 8 in the morning, and inside the Radio Tokyo broadcasting studio overlooking the bombed streets of wartime Japan, the air hung thick with humidity and the distant wail of sirens that never seemed to stop anymore. Iva Taguri Dakino, a 29-year-old UCLA graduate from Los Angeles who the world would soon hunt as the infamous Tokyo Rose, adjusted her headphones and prepared for what she thought would be just another routine broadcast, another day of playing American swing music and cracking jokes to keep herself alive behind enemy lines. She had been trapped in Japan since 1941, stranded 6,000 miles from home when Pearl Harbor turned the Pacific into a war zone overnight. For 3 long years she had sat behind that microphone, playing Duke Ellington and Benny Goodman, teasing lonely servicemen in her raspy unmistakably American voice, calling them boneheads and knuckleheads, never imagining that scattered soldiers across distant islands were weaving her broadcasts together with dozens of other female voices into a single mythical villain they called Tokyo Rose. She thought the war would end by winter because everyone whispered it in the hallways and on the streets. Japan couldn't possibly hold out much longer against American firepower, or so it seemed. Then the fragmentary transmission arrived and everything changed in an instant. Radio engineers stopped talking mid-sentence as telephones erupted with frantic calls throughout the building. A messenger burst through the corridor carrying a decoded military telegram from Hiroshima headquarters, and the words were fragmentary, transmitted in those final desperate seconds before all communication from the city ceased entirely. Entire city destroyed by single bomb, the message read. Unknown weapon, casualties catastrophic, request immediate, and then it ended abruptly mid-sentence as if whoever was sending it had simply vanished from existence. Iva watched as engineers and military officers crowded around that telegram, their faces pale and disbelieving. Impossible, they muttered to each other. It had to be a freak accident, American propaganda, some kind of mistake in the transmission. But their faces betrayed something she had never seen in 3 years of wartime broadcasts, genuine terror that cut through all the false optimism and propaganda they had been fed. Then the reconnaissance report arrived and confirmed the impossible. Only 3 B-29 bombers had been tracked over Hiroshima that morning, just 3 aircraft, not 300, not a massive fleet darkening the sky, but 3 planes. They reported a mushroom cloud rising 40,000 feet into the air, visible from 150 miles away, glowing with colors that didn't seem natural. An entire city of 350,000 people spread across 27 square miles had simply been vaporized in a single blinding flash. Iva whispered to a stunned announcer beside her, 3 planes can't destroy a city, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them because clearly they had. For 3 years she had believed, or tried to believe, that America was losing this war, that Japan's warrior spirit would outlast American firepower, that distance and determination would eventually force a negotiated peace that would let everyone go home. Every broadcast she made had been built on that assumption, every joke, every song, every teasing insult carried the unspoken belief that American boys were demoralized and defeated and desperate to return home. On August 6, 1945, in that moment when she read that fragmentary transmission, she learned the devastating truth. America hadn't been losing at all. America had been holding back, restraining its full power, and the Americans weren't coming home defeated as Japanese propaganda had promised for years. Instead, they had unleashed the sun itself upon the earth, a weapon so devastating it rendered every previous calculation of military power completely obsolete. Iva Taguri, the woman who never once called herself Tokyo Rose, suddenly understood with perfect clarity that her fate was sealed, not because she was guilty of treason, not because she had betrayed her country, but because someone would have to pay for 3 years of hell in the Pacific, and she was the only American voice Japan had ever put on the air. The microphone light glowed red, signaling her turn to broadcast, but to understand how an American girl born on Independence Day in Los Angeles ended up behind an enemy microphone preparing to face her own country's rage, you need to know the story that almost nobody believed, the story of the woman who refused to betray America even when that refusal meant starvation and death. Iva Taguri was born on July 4, 1916, Independence Day in Los Angeles, California, and the irony of that date would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was the daughter of Japanese immigrants, but America was the only home she had ever known or wanted. She sold cookies as a Girl Scout, sang hymns every Sunday in the Methodist Church choir, studied zoology at UCLA with dreams of becoming a doctor someday. She spoke fluent English and barely knew a single word of Japanese. By every measure that actually mattered, she was American through and through. In July 1941, her parents asked her to do them a simple favor. Her aunt in Japan was gravely ill and fading fast. Could Iva visit her, just for a few months, as a graduation gift and family obligation combined? She booked passage on a ship to Tokyo, packed light because she'd only be gone a short while, and promised her parents she would be home by Christmas. Then December 7, 1941 happened and Pearl Harbor shattered the world in a single morning. Overnight, every ship crossing the Pacific became a military target. The cost of evacuation was $425, which might as well have been $400,000 for a young woman with no resources. Iva was stranded 6,000 miles from home, an American citizen trapped in a nation now at war with everything she knew and loved. The Japanese military police came for her in early 1942, demanding she renounce her American citizenship, sign the papers, declare loyalty to the emperor. It would make everything so much easier, they promised her. She would get food rations, protection, a future in this new world order they were building. Iva refused with 3 simple words that sealed her fate. "I am American," she told them. Those 3 words meant they classified her as an enemy alien with no ration card, no legal employment, no protection whatsoever under Japanese law. By 1943, she was dying slowly from starvation and disease. Scurvy ravaged her gums until they bled constantly. Beriberi swelled her legs until she could barely walk without crying out in pain. She spent 6 weeks hospitalized, her body literally breaking down from malnutrition and neglect, and when they finally released her she was skeletal, exhausted, and desperate for any way to survive. That's when Radio Tokyo found her and offered her a job as a typist. The pay was minimal, almost nothing really, but it came with precious food rations that meant the difference between life and death. Iva took the job, typing scripts in a cramped office that always smelled of cigarette smoke and desperation. That's where she met the 2 men who would change everything, Major Charles Cousins, an Australian prisoner of war, and Captain Wallace Ince, an American POW. 2 men who had been forced at gunpoint to create propaganda broadcasts but who were secretly working to sabotage those broadcasts from within, slipping in coded messages and subtle mockery that Japanese censors couldn't detect. They needed someone they could trust completely, someone authentically pro-American, someone whose voice was too rough, too masculine, too genuinely American to fulfill Japan's fantasy of a sultry seductress whispering poison into GI ears. They chose Iva because she was perfect for their purposes. She called herself Orphan Anne, a darkly humorous joke about being stranded far from home, and her broadcasts became this strange mix of defiance and comedy that walked an impossible tightrope. She played American swing music that Japanese censors couldn't understand the subversive lyrics to. She told servicemen this is your favorite enemy and with a laugh that made it impossible to take the threat seriously. She called them boneheads and knuckleheads in her raspy California accent that reminded them of home. She never used the name Tokyo Rose because she had absolutely no idea that lonely soldiers scattered across the Pacific were inventing that legend in their imaginations, blending dozens of different female broadcasters into one mythical seductress. To Iva, she was just surviving, slipping jokes past censors, playing the music she loved, secretly smuggling food to Allied prisoners when guards weren't looking. But every single broadcast was a paradox she couldn't escape no matter how hard she tried. If she made the shows too boring, Japanese officials would replace her with someone who actually believed the propaganda and would deliver it convincingly. If she made them too entertaining, American soldiers listening might think she was genuinely trying to demoralize them and break their spirit. She walked this impossible tightrope between collaboration and resistance, never knowing which side would catch her when she inevitably fell. Some nights, lying alone in her tiny apartment, she wondered desperately if anyone back home understood what she was really doing. Did they hear the sarcasm dripping from her voice? Did they catch the subtle ways she undermined every script they gave her? Or did they just hear a traitor selling out her country for a bowl of rice? By August 1945, she had broadcast over 340 programs, played hundreds of American songs, cracked thousands of jokes, and maintained her American citizenship through starvation, illness, and constant threats. She genuinely thought her voice was harmless, just a small act of defiance wrapped in comedy and swing music, but she was catastrophically wrong about that. The legend of Tokyo Rose had been born in the imaginations of lonely American soldiers scattered across the Pacific Theater, and that legend demanded a sacrifice. When the war ended in August 1945 after those 2 atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Iva allowed herself to imagine freedom for the first time in years. She had recently married Felipe D'Aquino, a Portuguese-Japanese man she met in Tokyo, and she was 2 months pregnant with their first child. The surrender should have meant she could finally go home, walk off a ship in San Francisco, breathe California air again, see her parents, explain everything. But as Allied occupation forces began arriving in Tokyo, a different reality crystallized around her like ice. American soldiers walked through Radio Tokyo's bombed-out corridors, examining equipment, interviewing staff, and their faces hardened when they learned English-language broadcasts had originated from this building. Whispers spread among the employees that America would make an example of someone, that somebody had to pay for 3 years of Pacific Island battles, for the kamikazes, for the death marches, for everything that had turned the Pacific into a massive graveyard. In September 1945, 2 American journalists arrived at her door with an offer that seemed like salvation at first. Harry Brundage and Clark Lee were hunting for a scoop, the exclusive interview with the real Tokyo Rose, and they were willing to pay $2,000 for it, a fortune. Iva hesitated because she had never called herself Tokyo Rose, but she desperately needed the money. Her husband had no work, she was pregnant, the occupation economy was collapsing. Just tell your story, they promised her, the truth, that's all we want. So she agreed and spent hours explaining everything, how she'd been trapped, how she'd refused to renounce her citizenship, how she'd starved rather than truly collaborate, how the POW broadcasters had recruited her to undermine propaganda from within. The journalists nodded sympathetically, took detailed notes, promised the interview would clear her name once and for all. Then they betrayed her completely. No payment ever arrived. Instead, they sold her story to media outlets as a confession, framing her carefully chosen words as admissions of guilt rather than explanations of survival. Headlines screamed Tokyo Rose speaks across America. The FBI arrested her in October 1945 and imprisoned her in Sugamo prison for a full year while investigators combed through every broadcast, every script, every witness they could possibly find. The FBI's final report actually concluded that her broadcasts were innocuous entertainment containing no anti-American propaganda whatsoever. They released her in October 1946, and she thought her nightmare was finally over. But in America, powerful voices were demanding blood and vengeance. Gossip columnist Walter Winchell, whose radio show reached 50 million listeners every week, launched a relentless campaign calling for her prosecution. The American Legion organized massive letter-writing campaigns that flooded congressional offices. It was 1948, an election year, and the Cold War was heating up. Prosecuting Tokyo Rose became politically irresistible for politicians trying to look tough. The trial began in July 1949 in San Francisco and lasted 3 brutal months. The jury deliberated for 4 agonizing days and deadlocked multiple times because most of them wanted to acquit her. The evidence of actual treason simply wasn't there. But exhausted and constrained by narrow jury instructions, they convicted her on one single count out of 8 charges, speaking into a microphone after the loss of an American ship, based on testimony from witnesses who would later admit they had been pressured and coached to lie. The jury genuinely believed she had already served enough time in prison and expected the judge would sentence her to time served and finally let her go home. They were catastrophically wrong. Judge Michael Roche sentenced Iva Taguri d'Aquino to 10 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine. Her American citizenship was revoked, making her stateless, a woman without any country in the entire world. 1 week later, alone in a cold prison hospital, she delivered a stillborn baby girl, the child she had been carrying since before the surrender, the child she had imagined raising in freedom. Her husband Felipe, a Portuguese citizen, was permanently barred from entering the United States, classified as an undesirable alien. The marriage that had sustained her through occupation and imprisonment was functionally ended forever. Iva served 6 years and 10 months in the Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, West Virginia, released in 1956 to return to Chicago where her elderly father ran a small import shop. For 21 years she lived as a ghost in her own country, working long hours stocking shelves, managing inventory, keeping her head down while customers who recognized her name would sometimes spit insults or walk out without buying anything. She was stateless, trapped in legal limbo, unable to vote in the nation she had refused to betray, unable to travel outside its borders, constantly threatened with deportation though no country would accept her. Then in 1974, 2 investigative journalists began digging through archives that had been sealed for decades, and what they discovered shattered the foundation of her conviction. Key prosecution witnesses had been coerced and coached for months. FBI agents had fed them specific phrases and details. Internal memos showed investigators knew the witnesses were lying but buried that evidence. The case had been built on perjury from the very beginning. On January 19, 1977, his last full day in office, President Gerald Ford granted Iva Taguri d'Aquino a full presidential pardon. She was 60 years old and more than 3 decades had passed since that fragmentary transmission from Hiroshima changed everything. When reporters asked for her reaction, she spoke quietly with measured dignity. "It is hard to believe," she said, "but I have always maintained my innocence. This pardon is a measure of vindication, not full vindication, because 32 years couldn't be returned, a stillborn child couldn't be brought back, a marriage couldn't be restored. The final truth that would follow her forever was this. Tokyo Rose never actually existed as a real person. She was an American invention, a legend born from loneliness, anger, and the human need to give evil a recognizable face and name. Soldiers listening to static-filled broadcasts in darkness had imagined a seductive enemy and merged dozens of voices into one mythical villain. But myths are always more powerful than facts, and legends outlive truth every single time. Iva Taguri d'Aquino had been sacrificed to that legend, not because she was guilty, but because someone had to pay for 3 years of hell. Someone had to embody the betrayal soldiers felt, and she was the only American voice the enemy had put on the air. She lived another 29 years after the pardon, working quietly in Chicago, rarely giving interviews, avoiding attention, and on September 26, 2006, Iva Taguri d'Aquino died at age 90, an American citizen officially pardoned and legally vindicated but never fully restored to the life that had been stolen from her.